Okay, good morning. Good or bad, telling the difference is hard. We all know being a programmer is mostly drinking coffee, Googling answers on Stack Overflow, and making choices. We make choices about which frameworks to use, which libraries to use, and how code should be written. Or to put it another way, which frameworks are good and which are bad, which libraries are good and which are bad, and what code is good and what code is bad. All of these things come down to what is good and what is bad. But what if pretty much all developers are just really bad at this core skill, or at the very least, nowhere near as good as they'd like to be? How can we either learn to make better decisions or cope with this disability? Well, telling the difference between good or bad software is quite tricky, so let's start with something easier. Can anybody tell me what this device is? First iPod, yes. Can anybody tell me when the iPod came out originally, did people think it was going to be good, or did people think it was going to be bad? Put your hands up for good. Put your hands up for bad. Yeah. When it first came out, people just were not impressed by the original iPod. As a guy on Slashdot said, no wireless, less space than a Nomad, lame. Okay, so how did the iPod actually do over its lifetime? Sold about 400 million units, which is not too bad for a device that's much more expensive than the MP3s that already came out, that were already out on the market. So there was obviously something about the iPod that made it sell lots of copies, even though it wasn't obviously good to begin with. Another easy question, can anybody tell me what this is? Okay. When the iPhone originally came out, I'd learnt my lesson from the iPod a little bit. I didn't think the iPod was very good when it came out, but then it sold lots. And when the iPhone came out, I thought that Apple would do reasonably well. I thought they might get 10, 20% of the market share, maybe a tiny bit more than that. But quite a few other people didn't think it was going to do that well. This is a quote from a guy that's approximately 1 million times richer than I am. So to get back at him, there's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. No chance. It's a $500 subsidized item. I would rather Microsoft have 2 or 3%. I would rather have our software on most of the phones than I would to have a small market share. So how did the iPhone actually do? Well, 2 billion iPhones sold, $1 trillion in revenue. You can make a pretty good argument that it's the most successful product in the entire history of mankind, which is not too bad for something that not everybody thought was going to be successful. So why am I giving this talk? In around 2009, 2010, I spent a lot of time on a forum for software developers, and people were still really criticizing the iPhone, and they were pointing out the things that weren't good about it, and saying that people were wrong for buying an iPhone. And it's just this massive disconnect that the iPhone was already selling really, really well. There's people that I respected as developers and I thought would be great people to work with, and they just couldn't see that the iPhone was successful for reasons they couldn't understand. And they weren't subtle about voicing how they didn't like the iPhone. They were very outraged that the iPhone was successful because they thought it shouldn't be. And so if you don't take anything away from this talk other than this, if you think something is bad but it's hugely popular, it's you that's failing to tell good from bad. It's not anybody else's problem, it's your problem that you're failing to see what's actually important and what's important that makes the difference between something being good and something being bad. So I think there's 2 main reasons why people have a great deal of difficulty telling the difference between good and bad. That comes down to emotions and the fact that math is hard. Most programmers like to think of themselves as coldly logical and rational beings, but really, really we aren't. software developers have their own preferences. They get bored of using current technology and want to start using new stuff. And sometimes they fixate on things. If you've not seen the web scale, or MongoDB is web scale video, I suggest watching it because it's a great example of how people just fixate on a new technology. Question, which of these two things is better? And this is a trick question, by the way. Which of these is better? Code that is easy to understand, has a good design and good test coverage, or code that is rough around the edges, is full of hacks and isn't fully tested? Who thinks the first one's better? Who thinks the second one's better? It's a trick question, you can't tell. We're attracted to the first one because that's what we like working with. That's a pleasant thing. We love working with clean code bases that are well tested. Is much more pleasant than working with hacky code bases that are difficult. But I didn't give you enough information to tell which of these is good and which of these are bad. I didn't say anything about which one actually does something useful, which one of these provides value for the business. And without that, that's really, if code is very clean but doesn't do anything useful, doesn't really matter. If code's a massive piece of hack but it's producing a lot of value for a company, the company's going to value that code a lot more. I'll talk about aesthetics in the second half of this talk when I suggest some ways of teaching yourselves to learn to be attracted to code in different ways. So the second reason why people fail to tell the difference between good and bad is that math is hard. And I don't mean mathematics in general, I mean just very simply counting numbers up. The human brain did not evolve to count numbers during evolution. We've learnt them now, but at a very deep level, we just don't process numbers very well. We can cope with numbers like 1 and maybe 2, but then bigger numbers like 4 and 5, our brains start to struggle with that numbers that big. And by the time you get to numbers like 216 million, our brains just fail to process numbers that big. I can give you a demonstration of this. If I told you a story about a little boy in Africa, his parents want to send him to school, but he's got malaria, and so he can't go to school because he's too ill. Hopefully that would produce a sad response. So you say, ah, fantastic. And it's not just the little boy who's affected, he's got a twin sister who also wants to go to school, and she's also got malaria and is too sick to go to school. So you can cope with those numbers. But when I say actually 216 million people in Africa are affected by malaria each year, does anybody want to claim that they feel 216 million times as sad as they did for one person? No. Something happens in our brain. We can count to 1, we can count to 2, but the numbers after that they fade away. You can see this more easily in business settings as well. I try and avoid stealing people's ideas all the time without quotes. This happens all the time. People worry about small values in business, but then something that's actually going to cost the business 10, 20 grand. Yeah, sure, have a meeting. Why not? So back to something more on topic for this conference. Some languages are just crap, as in, if you go to an expert in their field and ask them, what do you think of this language? Pretty much all of the experts will tell you this language is rubbish. Does anybody know what language I'm thinking of? Wrong. English. English is an objectively crap language. If you go to anybody who's studied languages, they'll just tell you it's just terrible. It's actually bad for ways that are quite similar to PHP. Other languages apart from English have a coherent design. English has acquired many words, many spellings over the years, and like all of these OUGHs are pronounced differently. And then on the other hand, these two reads are also, although they're spelled the same, they're also pronounced differently. And this is quite similar to PHP, which has a standard library that's been acquired, and it's there, but it's not been designed. Some people say that PHP is the Borg of computer languages. And PHP keeps old designs around, and English keeps old spellings around. So when I was doing the research for this talk, I picked up some of my favourite old spellings. So won't is an abbreviation of what word exactly in English? Will, but will's got an I in it. That's a no. Won't is an abbreviation of either vol not or vonot, two English words that haven't actually been part of the English language for about 500 years. But to avoid having backward compatibility breaks, we've kept won't around. The second word is a place name and a family name. Does anybody want to shout out how they think this is pronounced? Oh. The second word is pronounced chummed lee. Okay, if you thought that was bad, does anybody want to attempt the last word on the slide? I'll give you a clue. You'll never guess it. Okay, so this is a word that has been pronounced this way for approximately 800 years. This word is pronounced fanshawe. That's, if you can look it up on Wikipedia, that's how it's pronounced. Very long backwards compatibility break there. English lacks features as well. Most European languages have applied to an informal way of saying you. English doesn't have this. And this is features we like to think of as great because they allow you to do things. So French, for example, has tu and vous, which allows you to be explicitly polite or explicitly familiar with somebody. And English doesn't have this. There's lots of Asian languages that have deferential ways of speaking to each other. Instead of directly asking for something, you'd make a suggestion and you'd hope that the other person would pick up on that fact, rather than making a demand for them to get you a drink. That's right. PHP also lacks features. We don't have threads, which means that there's some things that are quite difficult to do in PHP, solve problems that require threading. And PHP lacks monkey patching, which exists in Ruby, which, just so I'll explain what it does on the slide. So basically, in Ruby, you can pull in a library and it will change how operators work. So on the first two lines, we divide 4 by 3, and we get a fixed number. As the result, we put in a library, we divide 4 by 3 again, and we get a rational or float number as the result. So because of these two reasons, neither PHP or English are used widely anymore because they're just not very good. Obviously, that's not quite correct. 80% of the web is powered by PHP. Lots of people speak English, and the number of people speaking English is growing. So I'm going to say this again. If you think something's bad, but it's hugely popular, you're failing to tell good from bad. And I think people just get confused about what is good and bad. People think features are good, and it's quite often not. Instead, ease of use is always more important. So both English and PHP, well, particularly English, is not consistent. This actually makes it easier to bring new words into the language. In some languages which have very set out rules of how to spell words, if you want to bring a foreign word in that's not spelt in the correct way, it doesn't look right, and it feels odd to use it. In English, we see a word, we take that word, we start using it. No one objects to it being used. There's no way for it to look out of place. And same is true with PHP as well. PHP was not designed, but over the years we've brought in features from other languages. So for example, PHP didn't have classes to begin with. Classes got brought in. Didn't have exceptions. Exceptions got brought in. And the language has grown organically, but there's never been a point when the PHP communities spent a huge amount of energy trying to define what is idiomatic PHP, which some communities, particularly the Go community, spend an awful lot of time arguing about rather than writing valuable software. And the lack of the feature of to and vous makes English easier. This is a diagram of when to use to or vous in French. Obviously, there's quite a few different rules. So things like if you're speaking to a family member, you probably want to use to, except maybe if they're significantly older than you and you don't know them that well, then you might use vous. You can get the thing that makes it this feature makes the language difficult to use because you just can never be sure exactly when you should be using to or vous. Obviously, you can give offence by using a familiar term when somebody is expecting you to use vous because they think they deserve that level of respect. But I managed to give offence the other way as well. I don't speak French very well at all. My dad's got a French girlfriend, and one time she thought I was deliberately using vous to exclude her from the family. And I just could not, I can't switch dynamically between s'il vous plaît and s'il te plaît. It's just not going to happen. And she thought this was me being deliberately rude. It wasn't. I'm always just accidentally rude more than anything else. English is much easier. English, it's really hard to give offence accidentally. I've tried to think of all the different ways you can give offence accidentally in English. Never say any of these phrases. And if you need an explanation of them, meet me. I'll be at the speaker's corner outside or perhaps at the social. Just don't ever use any of these phrases in conversation. But because English it's so hard to give offence accidentally, this makes it very easy to start conversations. Anybody can go up to anybody else and start talking to them and not worry, am I being polite enough? Is this person going to take offence? So this is great when you're talking about code or working on projects. You can speak to somebody else and you're not going to give offence that easily. So yeah, features generally make things harder to use. Ease of use things accumulate over time. So things that, when I say ease of use, things that make little things be a slightly bit easier. So nothing that's going to change the world, just makes your life a little bit easier each day. But because those involve big numbers, people really underestimate their value. So on the iPod, there was two things that they did that Apple did that made it really easy to use. At the time when the iPod was originally released, the software for ripping CDs and putting MP3s onto the MP3 players was terrible. The iPod was the first thing that was sold where you could drop a CD into a computer, walk away, and your music would be on the iPod. And this was particularly great for people with lots of music who didn't want to have to sit there ripping the software by hand. But the really big thing was the wheel interface. So the iPod could fit about 500 albums on it when it came out. But there were other MP3 players that could fit that music on there. The problem was, for all the other MP3 players that have a button to advance, if you've got 500 albums, you've got to sit there clicking the next album button 500 times or so to get to the album you want. With the wheel interface, you can just turn your thumb faster or slower to change album, and it's really intuitive and really easy. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons why the iPod sold so well. So, why did the iPhone do so well. So at the time when the iPhone came out, people thought that phones were like fashion items. This is a quote from a business analyst. At the time the iPhone was released, there was an expectation that Apple would need to release new models every 3 months or so to keep up with the fashion choice available for other brands. This is really back to front. Giving people choice of which model to buy makes it more difficult to buy a phone. If you walked into a phone shop and said, I want to buy an iPhone, there you go, here you go sir, that'll be so much money. If you walk into a phone shop and you would say, I want to buy a Nokia phone, they say, right, well, here's 30 different models, which one do you want to buy? And then you have to spend time going through them and trying to figuring it out. So not giving people the choice of which model to buy made it a lot easier for people to actually buy an iPhone. And the iPhone lacked features but had great ease of use. So when it came out, no copy and paste, no MMS, no Flash, which turned out to be a great thing, no Java, really simple interface. Apple left those features out, at least in part, because they spent a huge amount of engineering effort into making the interface scroll smoothly. So I mean, like when you slide the screen, it doesn't jank, it doesn't stop moving momentarily. Obviously, Apple are quite secretive about exactly how they develop software, but my understanding is about 50% of the engineering effort for the iPhone was spent tweaking the operating system, tweaking the CPU hardware, tweaking Safari to make sure that it's possible for the latency for a movement coming from the input device through to the CPU and being responsive was always under a very small amount of time. Similarly, PHP lacks features but has greater ease of use. Because it doesn't have threads, instead it has a shared nothing model. That makes it much easier to write code. You don't need to worry about mutexes or locks. Doesn't have monkey patching, which means you can look at some code and figure out what it's going to do without having to see what libraries have been loaded. Doesn't have a long compile step, which means so you can just edit the code, refresh the page or rerun a test, and it's there in under 5 seconds. Compare that to Java, say, where you've got to recompile an application and deploy it as a jar, which takes a minute or so. And yeah, for serverless, PHP has been doing that since approximately the last millennium. So hopefully I've convinced you, at least in part, that there is something to this, that people are very bad at telling the difference between good and bad. If you're at all interested in the subject, there's 2 books I can strongly recommend. The Black Swan by Nicholas Taleb is a book about how people use knowledge, or how they make decisions based on the knowledge they have. And to spoil it slightly, people are not quite as smart as they think, and they think that knowledge helps them make better decisions when a lot of the time it doesn't. And Systemantics is a book that honestly should be required, or in my opinion, should be required reading for anybody that's ever going to deploy a computer program. It talks about how systems are fundamentally more complex in ways that are not natural to human brains. As I said, I strongly recommend that book for anybody who's ever going to be deploying software. Okay, so the rest of the talk is I'm going to spend some time suggesting ways of how you can improve. I've come up with some suggestions. I tried to group them under topics, but I realised that there's quite a bit of overlap between all of these suggestions. So I'll just introduce what the areas are first before going through the actual suggestions. So spend energy on learning to make better choices, recognise how your emotions affect your decision making, accept you're going to be wrong, and always prioritise ease of use over features. So some skills you'll learn quite naturally. Things like riding a bike. Yes, somebody needs to show you how to get on a bike and how to start pedaling. But once you're able to do that and you start pedaling away, you don't really need any special instruction. You just ride your bike and you'll become a better bike rider. Not everything's like this. Things like eating healthily take mental effort. I don't know about you, but when I've had a good programming session in the morning and I realise I've missed lunch by an hour or so, so I stumble out of the office, walk down the street, trying to find some food, I quite often end up at this place. And it takes some effort for me not to go here, because this place is fantastic. It provides me with 100% of my salt and fat requirements for the week in a single meal. But to not end up here, I have to think about it. I have to either force myself to go and buy something that might be a bit more expensive but would be more healthy, or even better, prepare some food at home the day before and bring that food into the office. And I think programming is like that. I think getting better at making good decisions is like this. It's something you need to deliberately put some mental energy into. You can go your whole life without thinking about your decision-making process and trying to figure out how to improve it. I'm not saying put a huge amount of effort into this. This is something I do a few minutes a week, maybe an hour a month, just reviewing what decisions have been made in the previous time period and what things are coming up that we'll need to think about. The second thing is that you need to recognise how emotions affect your decision-making process. Programmers just have a strong preference for making choices that will sound attractive to them. Playing with new technology always sounds fun. Writing documentation pretty much always sounds boring. Rewriting stuff from scratch is a lot more fun than refactoring old code one step at a time. And to be clear, I'm not saying try and suppress your emotions. First of all, without decades of mental training, that's not going to happen. So it's not a useful thing to attempt. But instead, acknowledge, yes, we're making this decision because, at least in part, we want to play with this new technology. There's a good chance it's not going to be the right choice. Let's use that new technology in a prototype or in a small piece of the application, rather than migrating the whole of our existing application to use it in one go. I often find as well that it's actually quite easy to observe my colleagues making emotion-based decisions. Theoretically, that's a good way of starting to learn how to recognise your emotions, watch it in other people. Theoretically, this could mean that teams would be able to make better decisions than individuals if you started double-checking each other. Is this really a good idea, or is this just something that sounds fun? And not only do I want you to not suppress your emotions, I want you to learn new ones, or at least learn new aesthetics. Kintsugi is an art form from Japan, where a piece of pottery that has been broken or is very old, has been broken, is repaired, but it's not repaired in a way that tries to hide the damage. It's repaired in a way that amplifies it or accentuates it. That makes it clear that this value was broken, but we treasure it enough to repair it in a way that celebrates the fact that it's been used and been damaged, but it's still a beautiful object. To me, this has some similarity to code bases. We all know that code bases get a bit ugly over time, but then when we're writing new code, hopefully that new code would be quite pretty, but we still need to join them together. And we can join them together in a way that celebrates the fact that we've got this old code that's providing a large amount of value to the business. Yes, it's joined onto some new code, but we're not going to ignore that fact. We're just going to appreciate it for what it is. Also from Japan, wabi-sabi. So in Western culture, most people have an ingrained attraction to things that are perfect, pristine, delicate, and expensive. Wabi-sabi is a Japanese aesthetic centered on the acceptance of transience and imperfection. It doesn't translate that well. The closest English word would be rustic, but it doesn't match that well. But this comes up a lot when I'm figuring out what I need to do to write an application. For an example, Kubernetes is a powerful new tool. Not everybody needs Kubernetes in their pipeline. For most sites, or for a lot of sites, just having a bash script that does the deployment until you've got some paying customers and you actually need to scale up. A simple bash script that does the job, takes 10 minutes to write, is a lot better than a full Kubernetes solution that takes months and months of DevOps time to implement. Wabi-sabi is derived from Buddhist teachings of impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and absence of self. And I don't know about you, but I've definitely worked on projects that have felt like those things to me. So the next piece of advice is you've got to accept that you're going to be wrong. I once worked with a development team that they were enterprise developers, so they did things properly and they didn't want to be wrong, and they felt bad if they did stuff or if they made choices and it turned out not to be the right thing. So they'd gotten themselves into a position where they're planning their work, doing it, and it turned out not to be the right thing. So the next time they planned for longer, did the work, and it turned out not to be quite the right thing. So the next time they planned for longer, did the work, and it turned out to be not the right thing. By the time I had to work with them, they were working on something that they said they would be delivered in 3 weeks. And I found out they were going to spend the first 2 weeks of that time planning, and then they're going to do all the work in the last week. I tried to say to them, how about this? Plan for 1 day, make version 1, throw it away. Plan another day, make version 2, throw that away, and then version 3's got a pretty good chance of being the right thing. So instead of spending too much time on trying to make good decisions, what you want to do instead is make it easier to correct mistakes. Has anybody in the room heard of the phrase agile software? Is anyone doing agile software? No hands. I'm just going to say that's unanimous but silent. Agile software is based around this, that we know that we can't plan out months and months of work. We know that what the business needs is going to change over time. So we need to iterate over a couple of weeks, do the work, and then go back to make new choices. The other thing I've started doing, and I think most projects should do this, is I write down how I make decisions. So for example, the last project I worked on, one of the decisions we had to make was which JavaScript build tool to use. So in my notes for the project, we have something like this. What JavaScript build tool should we use? Yarn was the answer, and we wrote down the reasons. It has better log file support than NPM, and we made the assumption that it was going to work just as well as NPM. But now we can look back at this decision and we've got more information. So now NPM has equivalent log file support to Yarn, so that reason for choosing Yarn over NPM has gone away, and the assumption that we made that Yarn was going to work as well as NPM turned out to be not quite true, because not as many JavaScript developers use Yarn as NPM. We found when we were upgrading versions, we've just found encountered a few bugs where stuff refused to install and gave highly cryptic error messages. And the JavaScript library developers just don't care about this much because most of them use NPM, so they're not going to go out of their way to fix bugs in something that they don't use. People sometimes accuse me of being quite cynical. They may have a point. But I think one of the reasons why projects, or why this isn't standard practice, is to protect senior people who are often the people who are making those choices. For various reasons, people don't like being shown to be wrong. They think it makes them look bad. Maybe it doesn't help them in the corporate warfare, or they think that it's going to remove some of their authority. I think this is something people need to overcome. You need to accept that you're going to make mistakes. You shouldn't be looking to blame somebody or point out, you're wrong, we're not going to trust you in the future. People make mistakes. As a team, you have to work to overcome them. And it's more important for an organization to work to correct mistakes than to protect senior people in the company from being shown to have made mistakes. The next piece of advice is, as individuals, you really need to start valuing ease of use over features. Currently, most developers will get a kick out of developing new features and less out of kick out of making ease of use things. As an example, if you had the choice of adding a new feature to a product or going through and standardizing all of the error messages so that all of the error buttons were here and all of the OK buttons were here, rather than having them in different locations in the application, standardizing things like that makes the application much easier to use for your users, but it's just not a fun thing to do, and it doesn't make people feel good about their work. At some point, I think this is something you just have to learn to acknowledge when you're making decisions about what you want to work on, and forcing yourself. Similarly to forcing yourself to eat healthy food, you have to force yourself to do things that are not as fun, but are going to provide ease of use for your application. And annoyingly, this is even worse at an organizational level. Developers get rewarded for delivering features. Developers don't get rewarded for delivering ease of use improvements. I actually do not have that many suggestions on how to solve this, except that it's something that needs to be addressed at an organizational level. The company has to go out of its way to deliberately reward people that work on things that aren't shiny and new. So in general, you need to make choices for ease of use, and not just for end users, but for developers as well. You need to make it easy to run your code from an IDE, because currently a lot of developers will edit code in their IDE, switch to the browser, and test it there, which that's not particularly efficient. It means that your code only runs in a browser, which means that it's very likely to be hard to test. If you start your development process by running your code from an IDE, it'll be a lot quicker turnaround, but also a very good chance the code will be easier to test. The next one is something I mucked up on a project. Debuggers need to be immediately available to end users. Sorry, not end users, developers. On a project, I mucked this up by, this is my first Docker project, so that's what I'm going to blame it on. To start debugging the application, you needed to stop the container, edit a config file to load xdebug, restart the container, and only then were you able to debug the application. And then once you're finished, you had to stop the container again, edit the config file, to remove Xdebug because it didn't always play nicely with all the other extensions, and then restart the container to continue the rest of the work. If you're using Docker, set up 2 containers, one that's got Xdebug, one that's not got Xdebug, and bind them to different ports. So that if you ever need to debug something on a page, you can just put in the port number, and it's the debugger's instantly there. Pretty obviously, you should always automate your deployments and tests. Do things like decouple your code from your framework, and name things so that they're easy to read. So I think I've been a bit too nice to Apple during this talk, and I think I should balance it out just a tiny bit. There's something that Apple did that they released a product that added a feature at the cost of ease of use. Does anybody know what I'm thinking of? Touch bar. Don't do this. This is a perfect example of what not to do. Pretty obviously, somebody in Apple came up with the idea of a touch bar, and it's a cool idea. It's a cool idea, but it's pretty much the worst thing ever. Although it's cool, it's actually not that useful most of the time for people, because a lot of the time people have their laptop connected to an external monitor, and the laptop's over here, so you can't even reach the touch bar. But it also just kills ease of use as well. Physical buttons are easier to find and press. The touch bar, you have to aim a lot more carefully, and for example, you can't do things like feel in the dark too. If you're working in a dark room and you want to just find the sound button on a keyboard with a button, you can just find it by hand. Oh, sorry, that's a bad example because it's illuminated, isn't it? Still, with touch is easier all the time. So, just going to run out of time. There's stuff that I didn't have time to talk about. Cheers, guys.